All right, U.S. history students, how are you? We're going to get started on a lecture on antebellum society. That just means ante, before, bellum means war. And so this is what happens in the United States. We just finished with Andrew Jackson, 1830s, and leading up to the Civil War in the 1860s, what was happening in the wider American society. So let's got 3 points. Let's take a look and have some fun. Okay, so first is going to be changes in technology. What were some major changes in technology during the early 1800s? And this is kind of the outgrowth of what we call the Industrial Revolution. But the first point we'll make here is the power of patents. In 1790, one of the first acts of the new Congress was a national patent law in order to allow people who had new ideas for technology or for different things that they could build or design to profit from it and also control it privately. And this basically meant it was a big motivator because if I can profit from a new idea, then I'm going to be more likely to work on it versus why go through the trouble of inventing something or improving something if you're not going to be able to get something out of it. And so this national patent law has oftentimes been called the most important law in American history to some extent because it unleashes an incredible amount of creativity due to profit incentive. And people, when they know they can get something out of it, they'll work really hard at it. And patents are a legal way. As a nation, we said we're going to honor that. We're going to protect your new ideas, not just physical property. You know, we talk about life, liberty, and property. It's not just physical property that needs protecting, but it's also intellectual property, and that's what this patent law represents. Um, Thinking about our current conflict with China, this is a big part of it because China is not necessarily stealing physical things from the United States, but it is stealing the creativity of our people and our businesses. We have then another key aspect of technology is the textile industry. I'm just going to move my picture so we can see it better. This is America's first major industry, the creation of cloth. And it's the man who gets the credit of that is an Englishman named Samuel Slater, who was familiar with new machines and steam-powered machines being designed in England. He decides that he's going to sneak out of England and help. Basically, I was just talking about the protection of new ideas. Well, here we go. He's going to steal these ideas and reproduce them in America, where there's less competition for him, and he can set up a new industry and thrive at it. He's not allowed to take anything with him, but he memorizes the plans and then rebuilds the machines from memory in New England, and kind of basically single-handedly starts out or jump starts the New England textile industry. New England, it was very popular there because one, the region wasn't great for the large plantations like in the South. You also had abundant waterways because that's where a lot of the first mills are going to be powered by water power, but also the water is crucial for even the running of steam engines. And so we get Samuel Slater and the textile industry. We also get a new industry, which is the coal industry, but then also the iron industry. In Western Pennsylvania, they discover a new type of coal referred to as hard coal. And that is just because it's a type of coal, anthracite, that burns hotter and longer than the other type of coal. And so not only is it more effective for, um, you know, for heating things, but it can actually get hot enough and maintain temperature enough to do something called smelting iron, which is purifying iron. So it's an energy source that's going to one play a key role in steam engines and especially the train, but also in the ability to create these metals, the higher gauge metals to use in these new machines, which iron is going to be necessary to do that. And it's this new type of coal that makes the smelting and the creation of that iron possible. And so again, as it says there, it spurs American industrialization because it's a new energy source, and a new energy source is key. And not only then, but it also creates this new building resource, iron, and you can build more powerful and different and high-powered and efficient machines when you have even an improved building material. I got the Steelers here because we got Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is known as the steel capital, or was as of the United States. Okay, another key technological breakthrough is the interchangeable part. And so that is kind of the standardization of materials within different products. You usually tell the story of Eli Whitney, who was an inventor, and he basically gets a contract to provide 10,000 rifles for the US government. And so he gets the order and he goes, okay, how on earth am I going to fulfill this order? It's going to make me rich, but I have to actually do it. How am I going to make 10,000 rifles? And so he says, he comes up with a plan of, rather than basically before this, you had the idea of a craftsman, and a single person would come and design and build each part of a rifle or any sort of machine or product by hand, and then assemble it. And it's what we would kind of think of as custom made. He's realizing, no, I need to get into what we're going to be called mass production. And so he designed a gun with interchangeable parts so that you could mass produce the stock and mass produce the sights and mass produce the bayonet and mass produce the firelock and all the different parts. And all those different parts could be assembled into any one particular rifle. We're very used to this model today now. But it was kind of just barely coming of age. And so we get this idea of mass production, makes things easier to produce. It makes them easier to repair. It makes them cheaper to produce, so then they're easier to buy, and completely begins to revolutionize the availability of various products, not just rifles, but various products to both producers, businesses, as well as consumers. Because again, the key thing is they can mass produce it, and if you can make something more cheaply, the price comes down and more people can buy it. And then if more people can buy something, that's called, now you have a bigger audience, or a bigger customer base. And so then you're going to get wealthier. Even though you're not charging as much for your gun, you have more people to sell it to. And so it's going to be a huge economic boost. And then we get kind of a tragic invention here. We get the cotton gin. Another one of Eli Whitney's inventions, probably his most famous, and that is the ability to remove the tiny seeds from a cotton bulb. It used to be done by hand, and it was extremely painstaking. If you've ever been to a museum and had to do it, they're tiny little things, and it was extremely slow. And he comes up with a simple machine. He's traveling down south. He was a northerner, but he's traveling down south, and he saw them doing this, and he thought, is there a way to innovate in this method? And he comes up with a simple kind of hand-cranked combing method of removing the seeds. And as you can see there, it's 50 times faster. So the ability to process cotton and get it able to use for textile manufacturing becomes so much faster, so much cheaper, that cotton goes from being not as lucrative or valuable of a commodity to being extremely valuable. They go from producing 2 million in a year to 2 million pounds to 2 billion pounds. In the South, the southern colonies or southern states begin to produce 7/8 of all the cotton in the world during this period because of this technological change that allows them to produce the cotton and basically refine the cotton in so much more efficiently. So that's, again, to the economy of the South, that's a huge boom. It tragically, of course, revives slavery, because not that in a way the actual pulling of the seeds becomes more efficient, but now there's more of a justification, more of a need for plantation slaves, because more cotton is being planted because it is such an incredibly valuable crop. And so it actually is credited with keeping and expanding the value of slave labor in the South, whereas at this point in the 1830s and 20s, many thought it would actually be in decline and potentially disappear, because slave labor just is not that efficient. Another tragic irony is because if that had happened, the South, everything would have been a lot better off. But South would have been forced to innovate. They would have been forced to industrialize and not become dependent upon slave labor and a single crop. But unfortunately, cotton for a series of decades does that. And so the South falls behind in terms of industrialization. They have much smaller cities, much fewer factories, much less innovation, because they rely more on just the brute slave labor of the plantation system. And so they fall behind the North drastically, or by an ever increasing margin, as far as what we're talking about in this lecture: technological and economic development. All effects, kind of tied to this cotton gin and the cotton industry. Okay, so secondly, outside of technology, we get a revolution in transportation, because another key thing for cost of products and economics is not only how do you produce it, but how do you get it where you need it to go. And so it's during these decades that we get new roads and higher quality roads, canals, and railroads that kind of unite parts of the nations that for a long time had been very disparate and isolated, or had a much slower pace of interaction. They're going to be able to, these new forms of transportation, those key ones, roads, canals, and railroads, are going to provide the ability to transport goods. And this is going to cause a shift to something we call a market economy. And that is that you begin to produce things not only for your own subsistence and maybe for your own small little community, but now there's a national or even maybe at least a regional market where I'm growing these things and maybe in greater quantities because I might be in Virginia, but I'm going to sell them in Georgia, or I might be in Ohio, but I'm going to sell them in Maine. And because you can now transport the goods so much quicker, this allows a revolution in terms of now I'm producing things not for my own subsistence, but for a market where I'm going to go and sell them. Excuse me. One of the most famous um, transportation developments is the Erie Canal. Again, the rivers, waterways. We talked about the Mississippi River coming up through New Orleans. They are the freeways of the pre, you know, automobile world. And the one development is this Robert Fulton. He develops a steamship, so this allows transportation up canals or riverways more quickly. They can now go faster against the tide because now you're not relying on just sail power, but you've actually got an engine driving the ship. You also get this famous Erie Canal, which connected Albany to the Great Lakes region, and the Great Lakes then connected to the Mississippi. And so it was like creating a vital artery of trade from the East Coast to the Midwest down into the South. And without getting all the details here, but basically it was an extremely expensive project because they had to cut through earth and waterways and create these different locks that raised and lowered the water levels and allowed things to move across land by water. But in 10 years, it paid for itself because it cut the price of goods by 95%. Because they were able to transport goods so much quicker, the cost of them began to plummet. Because like I said, the two things, if you can manufacture things differently, that'll change the cost. But also if you can transport them, it's not as expensive to get your product to market. You don't have to charge as much for your product. And so it becomes a huge boon. And then other expanding waterways do the same. Yeah, you see it linked New York City to New Orleans. So now there is a waterway, a quick and much less expensive than a roadway of getting your goods all across the country, up and down. And then, of course, we get the famous Iron Horse, the train system. So you saw the steamship. You're also going to get the steam engine powering these new locomotives. From 1830 to 1860, the country goes from having 32 miles of railroad track to 30,000. And so that is a revolution in the ability to move both goods, but also people up and down and east and west throughout the nation. It's going to cause new cities to rise up, Chicago, Indianapolis, because now it's kind of like when you think about suburbs. If you have a quick way of transporting, you don't have to live. You can live in new locations and gain access to new resources. So you're going to have new hubs of commerce, and those are going to become these major cities like Chicago and Indianapolis. It becomes, by the 1860s, the most important means of transportation, and again, completely continues to tie the United States together. The picture here was the famous race between the steam engine, the steam locomotive, and a horse. Because again, these are not moving at the speed that you picture trains. The first ones moved very, very slowly, but there came the crucial point where it was clear that the steam engine was faster and longer lasting and didn't require the rest or even the care required of a horse. And that was the key moment in which rail transportation was clearly the way of the future. And actually, in this race, the horse wins because the steam engine breaks down. But it performed well enough; people could see it was the way of the future. And again, this isn't exactly transportation, but it is. It's the transportation of ideas. And we have here communication, Morse code. Samuel Morse, who develops an electronic means of sending what were originally French flag signals, like you would across ships, like ships communicating at great distances. They weren't shouting at each other. They would use flags to send various messages. And he adapted that into electronic signals along a telegraph line. And so in 1844, the first telegraph in the United States is sent from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and he sent across, "What hath God wrought?" That was the first telegraph message, basically signaling a major breakthrough in the history of humanity, the ability to now send communication almost instantaneous. And then you can see, again, Atlantic, just think about, they lay one of these cables across the Atlantic Ocean, and now instead of taking weeks to sail, and steamships were making it a little faster to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, in a few minutes you could tap across a Morse code message. And again, we can appreciate this with the internet, but it was a like transformation in the ability to communicate across vast distances very, very quickly. And then our last big change is technology, transportation, and then reform. And that is reform movements and religious movements during the early 1800s. We actually have what is now known as what we call the Second Great Awakening. And that is like the first, a huge outpouring of religious fervor and revival, both in the East, but especially in the Western new states on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. But in the East, you have various revivals and prayer meetings. You have a re-emphasis on missions and missions to the Indians and missions to the poor. And we'll talk about education in a minute. In the West, they have these famous frontier camp meetings. And you have pastors who are known as circuit riders who basically just ride all throughout different parts of the West, preaching at various states. They don't have a home church, but because everybody's so few and far between, they ride from church to church or camp to camp or settlement to settlement. And there's really just kind of as it says there, an unleashed widespread zeal to reform society. What breaks out of this great awakening is a desire to use the gospel to improve society. Where are we flawed and where can we improve? And it almost becomes kind of a utopian or your will be done on earth as it is in heaven mindset. How can we advance the human race? One of those areas is, in the American society, if not the human race, but one of those is in education. And so we get during this period the transition from private education to public education, where again, originally education was done in the home or it was done in the church. Parents taught their kids or they had a small schoolhouse. But what comes out of this Second Great Awakening is the idea that no, the government needs to establish public schools and the state needs to take a larger role in making sure that every kid in their borders receives an education. Literacy continues to be a high, great emphasis. And one reason that this is connected to the religious awakening is that they saw sin. They began to have this view of sin as the result of ignorance. That basically, if we can just educate people, and this is where the kind of more of an enlightenment influence comes in, if we can just educate people and we can remove sin and improve society. If people just knew better and they had greater opportunities in their life, they wouldn't so quickly fall into sin, which in a lot of ways, which is absolutely true. But we'll talk about some of the dangers in that thinking in a second. And so the idea of training teachers and having teacher schools and colleges that prepare teachers, that whole movement of what we might consider a modern education system really takes a jump start during this period, the early 1800s. You get kind of the first textbooks. This thing's called a McGuffey Reader, who was a Christian man who wanted to give as many people as possible access to biblical stories and classical stories and they all had a very moral element to them, as well as teaching them history, science, and literature, and grammar and all that stuff. Okay, education. We have one of the leaders of this movement is a man named Horace Mann, and here you can kind of see the utopian zeal. He says, if we can but turn the wonderful energy of this people into a right channel, what a new heaven and earth might be realized among us. That was this Second Great Awakening zeal. How much of heaven can we realize here on earth? For him, it was education. But you'll see there were some other channels. One is prohibition. Drunkenness was a leading cause of harm and domestic abuse and child abuse and loss of job and death. And so there was a great movement towards temperance during this period. Temperance means just kind of reducing the amount of alcohol. Some went so far as to advocate prohibition, which is actually making all drinking of alcohol illegal. And we'll talk, obviously, the most famous examples of prohibition come in the 1930s when it actually becomes a constitutional amendment. But it's a movement that began over 100 years prior to that, because alcohol abuse was a very real problem. And the effect, we can actually see the effect that it had is in that the average consumption of alcohol was 7.1 gallons a year by the average American. After following the influence of these temperance movements, it drops to 2 gallons a year. Today, it's 2 gallons a year. So sometimes we think of, well, they were just religious prudes who were totally against alcohol and were freaking out over that and trying to control people's lives. No, it was a very real problem. They were drinking over 3 times as much alcohol as the average American drinks today. And the need for it seemed stark. And that was one of the again, personal, familial, and social evils that this new revival reform movement was trying to deal with. And we actually get our first prohibition law, not by the federal government, but by states. That's the other thing we don't realize is when we talk about prohibition, a lot of states had their own prohibition laws long before the federal government tried to make it across the entire nation. We also get women's rights, women's suffrage, their ability to participate politically. Women were huge leaders within these various reform movements, whether it was education, prohibition, or even women's suffrage. They oftentimes referred to this as the super politics. They couldn't run for office, they couldn't participate in the government, they couldn't vote. But they had this idea of, well, we're going to go even beyond or super beyond the political and actually reform society itself, which is an interesting conversation because in many ways, that's where real change happens. Outside of the political sphere, usually politics really just reflect what's going on in the wider society. And the solution that many women came upon in this period was we need to just influence the society, and then the politics will follow afterwards. They had the famous Seneca Falls Convention. In terms of, again, you can see whether it's property rights, voting rights, educational rights, or employment rights for women. And their exclusion, women's exclusion from a lot of the political involvement, again, not being involved in the actual government, led them to seek not only women's rights, but larger rights, the rights of all minorities or out groups. And that, of course, includes one of the most famous examples, the rights of slaves in the United States. Probably at the heart and soul of the reform movement of the 1830s is the abolition movement, the move to we cannot tolerate slavery. Both the Enlightenment and the religious forms, and it was there even at the founding of the nation, but that's as they begin this zeal to reform, that's one of the first things they cast their eyes upon is we've got to get rid of this stain on our nation of slavery. One of the leading proponents of that was William Lloyd Garrison, leader of a newspaper up in New England, who just advocated for the immediate setting free of all slaves in the United States. Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave, we'll be reading some speeches by him. He becomes the face of the eloquent, educated, and Americanized African American who could show what was possible if Americans would only give blacks their freedom. You have underground resistance movements led by Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad, and then even more violent moves, which Nat Turner is a slave who leads a violent slave revolt during this period. And so in many different levels, you have the society. They knew this is a cancer. This is a contradiction within the American values, and it's got to be dealt with. And following, again, the distractions of the Revolution, the distractions of forming a new constitution, the distraction of the War of 1812, comes the feeling of we've got to do something about slavery. This is William Lloyd Garrison. The Constitution is a league with death and a covenant with hell, because he saw the Constitution as condoning slavery and thought we need to do whatever we can to remove it, even if it is a complete change or abolition of the Constitution itself. Some people considered him far too radical, but he was one of the leading voices. Okay, so what? And obviously we'll be talking a lot more about, in this unit, we'll be getting into the expansion, into the slavery issue, and finally into the Civil War. So that's just the very tip of the iceberg on that topic. But the big key ideas, the patent law. It's one of the most important laws in American history because whether it's the railroad, the steam engine, canal technology, interchangeable parts, whatever it is, the ability to protect people's ideas so that they are motivated and they have a profit incentive to work and to invent. That's one of the greatest achievements that the United States has come across as far as being a land of laws, a nation of laws, because your property, and really your most important property, is not your house or your car or your clothing. Your most important property is right here. And the United States from an early point said we're going to protect that. And that unleashed incredible innovation and continues to unleash that innovation in our nation. This economic shift to the market revolution, which is, again, the change from subsistence farming to now large-scale industrial economy. We are now creating things. We used to have, it was kind of called, another word was a cottage industry, where cottage being a home. Everything we do is just for our home. We make our own clothes, we grow our own food, we farm our own animals, we repair, we build our own house. Now you're going to have the idea that no, I'm going to make something not for me, and I'm going to make a lot more of it on a scale that I don't need because now I have the transportation and the ability to get it to market where other people will buy it. And I can now specialize in a specific production of something, specific crop, specific item, and that I can sell at market and make my living that way. That's a change from how people had lived for thousands of years. And finally, we get this democratization and the Second Great Awakening, where you have this desire to reform and improve society. Some using biblical models, whether it's slavery, women's rights, education, the ones we've mentioned. And again, a very powerful thing of the gospel basically saying man is sinful, but the gospel tells us we can be better and that we want to be progressing and we want to be improving. And it does a lot of good in society. But there's also a little bit of a warning here because we begin to get this secular utopia idea of the perfection of man. The idea that man's sin is not a result of inherent sinfulness in his nature, but it's simply an issue of education. And that if we just create the right society, we will no longer have these broken people. And we're going, as we get more and more into U.S. history, we're going to see that that's actually a very dangerous and flawed outlook that leads to a lot of difficulty and losses of freedom. But you have both there. Again, it starts out as a biblical movement, but whenever they begin to remove the biblical view of man from it, you start to get trouble. So watch out for that as a theme as we move forward through the course. All right, appreciate your attention. We'll cut this off now. It's been long enough, and we'll talk in more detail in class. If I can learn how to turn the computer off.